Recording. There we go. Well, hello everyone, and welcome to Redemption Lutheran Church's continuation, finale, if you will, of our strange stories of the Bible. Today we'll be delving into the book of Mark, when Jesus curses the fig tree. Why did Jesus curse the fig tree? Did he hate fig Newtons? We don't know, but we're going to delve in and we're going to find out. So to start, we're going to start again like we usually do with our video. This is a video, again, from the Bible Project. They do great work, but it's going to give you an overview of the whole book of Mark. And when you're watching it, I want to make sure you pay attention to the fact that the story that we get about the fig tree starts, we're going to be looking at chapter 11, verses 12 through 25. So it's chapter 11 that it's in. And when you see the structure of the book that they lay out, pay attention to where chapter 11 is in that structure. But again, we're going to be in chapter 11, so just that'll be important a little bit later. So let me share my screen here. That one. Share. Need to turn off my sound.
The Gospel according to Mark. It's one of the first accounts of the life of Jesus, and our earliest historical traditions link this book to a Christian scribe named Mark, or John Mark. He was a co-worker with Paul and a close partner with Peter. And in fact, an ancient church historian named Papias, he recalls that Mark had collected all of the eyewitness accounts and memories of Peter and then shaped them into this account. But Mark didn't just randomly throw the pieces together. He's carefully designed this story of Jesus. In the first line of the book, Mark makes this claim about Jesus. It's the beginning of the good news about Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God. Now, what's interesting is that this is the only time Mark is going to tell you what he thinks. For the rest of the book, he's going to influence you by simply putting Jesus's actions and words in front of you and showing you how other people react to him. Now, Mark's designed the story of Jesus as a drama with 3 acts. The first one set in Galilee, the third one is set in Jerusalem, and the second act shows Jesus on the way from one place to the other. And each of the acts focuses on a repeated theme. So in Act 1, everybody's blown away by Jesus, and they're wondering, who is this Jesus? In Act 2, it's the disciples who are struggling to understand what it means for Jesus to be the Messiah. And then in Act 3, we watch the surprising paradox of how Jesus becomes the Messianic king. Let's just dive in and you'll see how it unfolds. After the opening line, Mark begins with a quotation from the ancient prophets Isaiah and Malachi, who said that God would send a messenger to Israel to prepare them for when God would show up himself to rescue his people and become their king. And Mark introduces John the Baptist as that messenger, and then right when you expect God to show up personally, Mark introduces Jesus. And as he comes onto the scene, the heavens open, God's Spirit descends on Jesus, and God says, "You are my beloved Son." After this, Mark places in front of us a summary of Jesus' core message. He went about Galilee announcing the good news that God's kingdom has come near. Jesus is carrying forward the story from the Old Testament scriptures about God's rescue operation for his world. Through Jesus, God is restoring his reign over the world by confronting and defeating evil and its hold on people's lives, and then by inviting them to live under his reign by following Jesus. From here, Mark's given us a big block of stories showing us Jesus' power as he brings God's kingdom. He goes about healing people whose bodies are sick or broken or under the oppression of dark spiritual powers. And Jesus even does something that for Jewish people only God has the right to do. He forgives people's sins. And Jesus' actions here produce lots of different responses. So some people follow him and become his disciples. Other people don't know what to think, and still others reject him completely, especially Israel's leaders who accuse him of blaspheming God and being empowered by evil. But Jesus isn't surprised by these responses. In fact, he draws attention to it. In chapter 4, Mark has collected many of Jesus' parables about the hidden, mysterious nature of God's kingdom. And Jesus says that his message is like seed falling on different types of soil. Some are receptive, some are not. Or it's like a mustard seed that's very tiny. It seems insignificant, but then it grows huge and surprises everyone. Jesus' point is that he really is the Messiah, bringing God's kingdom, but it doesn't look like what anybody expected. And this growing confusion about Jesus among the crowds is connected to a key idea Mark emphasizes at the end of Act 1, that even among Jesus' disciples there's confusion. Even they are struggling to grasp who Jesus really is, and that brings us to Act 2. It begins with a crucial conversation. Jesus takes the disciples aside and he asks, "Who do you all say that I am?" And Peter speaks up saying, "You're the Messiah." But it becomes clear that for Peter, this means that Jesus is a victorious military king from the line of David who will rescue Israel from the Romans. But for Jesus to be the Messiah means that he's the suffering servant king of Isaiah 53, who will bring God's rule by giving up his life in Jerusalem. And the disciples, they don't get it. They think following King Jesus is going to mean fame and status and importance, and Jesus makes it clear that following him is actually like dying, like carrying your own cross. It means rejecting violence and pride and selfishness and giving one's life out for others in acts of service and love. He has the same conversation with them 2 more times, and it all culminates in Jesus' important statement that the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to become a servant and give his life as a ransom for many. The disciples still don't get it. They respond in confusion and fear. And so here in Act 2, Mark has placed another key story that echoes the book's introduction. Jesus takes 3 of his disciples up to a mountain, and he's suddenly transformed. He's radiating with light and glory, and a cloud envelops them. Now, this is just like the glory of the God of Israel that showed up long ago on Mount Sinai. And then the 2 prophets who stood in God's presence on Mount Sinai, Moses and Elijah, they appear next to Jesus as God announces again, "This is my beloved Son." Now, by placing this story in the middle of all these conversations in Act 2, Mark is making an astounding claim that Jesus, God's Son, is the physical embodiment of God's own glory. And in Jesus, the glorious God of Israel is going to become king by suffering and dying for the sins of his own people. It's a puzzling claim that confuses and scares the disciples as they leave the mountain. Which brings us to Act 3. Jesus makes a very public royal entry into Jerusalem for Passover. People are hailing him as the Messiah. Then he enters into the temple courtyard and he asserts his royal authority by running out the thieves and crooks and stopping the sacrificial system. Then this kicks off a whole week of Jesus debating and confronting the leaders of Israel, condemning their hypocrisy, and so they set in motion a plan to have him killed. And Jesus warns his disciples, predicting that Jerusalem and its temple will be destroyed within a generation, and his disciples will be persecuted just like him, until he returns one day to bring God's kingdom fully over the world. And it all leads up to the final night. Jesus has his last Passover meal with the disciples, a symbolic meal that told the story of Israel's liberation from slavery through the death of the Passover lamb. And Jesus takes these symbols and he gives them new meaning. They point to the liberation from sin and death that will happen through the death of the suffering servant Messiah. From here, the story rushes forward to Jesus' arrest, his trial before Israel's priests and the Roman governor Pilate, all resulting in Jesus' crucifixion. And it culminates in a key scene that matches the important scenes from Acts 1 and 2, except this time it's darkness that descends, not a cloud. And instead of the divine voice from heaven, it's Jesus' voice crying out before he dies. And then most surprising is that it's a Roman soldier who sees Jesus die, who grasps and then announces who Jesus is. This of God. He's the first person in the story to recognize the story's shocking claim about Jesus' identity, that it's the crucified Son of God who's the Messiah, Jesus of Nazareth, who died for his friends and for his enemies. After this, Jesus' body is placed in a tomb, and on the first day of the new week, 2 women from his disciples come to the tomb, and they discover that the tomb is empty, the stones rolled away, and an angelic man informs them that Jesus isn't here, that he's risen from the dead. And so he orders them to go and tell this good news to the other disciples, that Jesus is alive, that he'll meet them back up in Galilee. And the women, they're freaked out. Mark says that they fled from the tomb in terror, telling no one, for they were afraid. And that's how the book ends, with Jesus' disciples showing the same kind of fear and confusion that concluded Acts 2 and 1. Now, if you look in your Bible, you'll see that the Gospel of Mark has more to its ending. where Jesus appears, he speaks to his disciples, but there's also a note there telling you that that ending is not part of the original book, that it's only found in later, less reliable manuscripts. Now, it's possible that the original ending got lost, or that Mark actually never finished writing his account, but it's more likely that this abrupt ending is intentional to make a point. The entire story has focused on the shocking claim that puzzled Jesus' disciples from beginning to end, that it's the suffering, crucified, and risen Jesus who's the Messiah, the Son of God. That God's love and upside-down kingdom were revealed as Jesus died for the sins of the world. And so this story ends without closure, and it forces you, the reader, to grapple with this very strange and scandalous claim about Jesus. And are you going to run away like the disciples? Or are you going to recognize Jesus as your king and go and tell the good news? And only you can answer that question. And that's what the Gospel of Mark is all about.
And we're back. So again, that gives us a good overview of the book of Mark. A few other quick facts, just to remember. Mark is the shortest gospel that we have. It's the shortest of Jesus stories about Jesus. So it's, many think that because it's the shortest, the author had very much intent on which stories were included. And there was thought put into why certain things are certain places and why there's such a structure. Because he didn't have a lot of paper, and he didn't have a lot of time, he didn't have a lot of chapters to tell this story. So if he's including something, it must mean something. And there's no filler here. There's no extra chapters. It's whatever is in here is important. It's also one of the earliest gospels. You've got Mark, and then he supposedly had a source called Q, the Q source. And that Mark and Q became the basis then for Luke and Matthew. John's off on its own a little more, but Mark came first, as we understand, in the stories of, in like the historiography of when the Gospels were written. And Mark was working off the Q source, just like Matthew and Luke were. Do you have any questions about Mark before we keep going? Or we read?
I don't. No.
Okay. Also, to anyone watching, we're glad Ginny is with us. We only got one tune in today, so we're going to have a good one-on-one discussion this afternoon, or evening rather. But we're going to jump into the reading. We are in Mark 11. It is chapter 11, verses 12 through 25. Do you want to read, or I can read? It doesn't matter to me.
Well, I have the King James version, so it might be easier for you to read.
I will read. This is the NRSV too, if anyone's following along at home. So it starts with Jesus curses the fig tree. On the following day, when they came from Bethany, I should say right before this was Palm Sunday, when Jesus gloriously came into Jerusalem. So this is right after Jesus enters Jerusalem. On the following day, when they came from Bethany, Jesus was hungry. Seeing in the distance a fig tree in leaf, he went to see whether perhaps he could find anything on it. When he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. He said to it, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." And his disciples heard it. Then they came to Jerusalem, and he entered the temple, and began to drive out those who were selling and those who were buying in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves. And he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. He was teaching and saying, "It is not written." He was saying, "Is it not written? My house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you have made it a den of robbers." And when the chief priests and the scribes heard it, they kept looking for a way to kill him, for they were afraid of him, because the whole crowd was spellbound by his teaching. And when evening came, Jesus and his disciples went out of the city. Excuse me. In the morning, as they passed by, they saw the fig tree withered away to its roots. Then Peter remembered and said to him, "Rabbi, look, the fig tree that you cursed has withered." Jesus answered them, "Have faith in God. Truly I tell you, if you say to this mountain, 'Be taken up and thrown into the sea,' and if you do not doubt in your heart, but believe that what you say will come to pass, it will be done for you. So I tell you, whatever you ask for in prayer, believe that you have received it, and it will be yours. Whenever you stand praying, if you have anything against anyone, so that your Father in heaven may also forgive your trespasses." And that's it. That is the story of Jesus and the fig tree, and it is a bit odd. again, it doesn't really give us much more to go on when you hear it. It's just Jesus curses a fig tree. And not only does Jesus curse the fig tree, Jesus curses the fig tree because it doesn't have figs on it, but it was not yet the season for figs. So the fig tree really had no chance. It's just, it wasn't time. But you can notice a few things where the story is contextually in the wider Mark. It's right at that hinge point between when Jesus was traveling to Jerusalem and Jesus gets to Jerusalem. So this is right at the beginning as we start kind of the whole narrative of Jesus' passion. So Jesus knew what he was getting into, and I imagine Jesus was not happy to be going to the cross necessarily. This was not a joyous event for him, and might be on edge. So some talk this story up to Jesus was just having one of those days. Jesus was hungry, even hungry and angry, and he wanted figs and he couldn't find figs, and he's about to be crucified and he's just not in a good place. So some are saying this shows kind of the emotional range of where Jesus is at the moment. And I can kind of understand that, but again, when we talk about Mark and how short it is, that doesn't seem like it's enough of a reason for this story to be there, at least to me. What else do you know about Jesus? What else is strange here, do you think? Do you have an idea of why you think Jesus would do this?
I don't, and I never realized that came into the place where he called the temple a den of thieves. Mm-hmm. And I always liked that story, part of the story, because it showed his human side of when something wasn't being done the way he thought that his father wanted it, and he got angry. And but as you said, the human side, that he was hungry and he knew ahead of him. And he was looking for figs, and that poor fig tree didn't have anything to offer him. So,
well, you actually bring us into the next question. Do you think the fig tree has anything to do with what happens in the temple? Or do you think there's any parallels there that could be drawn?
There has to be. I don't know if I see it, but I think there's a parallel because it's as he's going in and as he's leaving. You know, it's sort of like the bookend of the story. I can't figure out what it has to do with what happened in the temple, but it's, coming before and at the end.
Yeah. And I don't know if there's a right answer to this question. I don't think there is. But for me, when I look at it, the one thing, or the one comparison you might be able to stretch or make is this idea of a fig tree that isn't bearing fruit, a thing that's supposed to bear fruit and be life-giving is not doing that. And so too the temple, which is supposed to be a life-giving place of prayer, is not being that because of the money changers and the collectors and everything. So Jesus cursing the fig tree is much like Jesus pushing the people out of the temple, because it's just in a different vision of how something that's supposed to be giving life is not, or something that's supposed to be giving sustenance, important sustenance, is not doing what it's supposed to do. But at the same time, you can draw that parallel, but it doesn't exactly square away with then what Jesus says to end the story, because Jesus has the opportunity to make that connection and he doesn't. Instead, he goes into this kind of talk about prayer, which is not bad, but also doesn't exactly answer the question. Because they say, they ask, the fig tree you cursed is withered, and Jesus answers them about, you would have the power to do this too, basically, but doesn't answer why. So I don't know if we ever get an answer. What do you think this story has anything to do with faith? Or where do they talk?
Well, as he brings in the faith afterwards, having faith and if what you ask for, and I guess if it's in, not I guess, I know if it's in God's will and you ask for it and have the faith that you will receive what's given, as long as it agrees with God's doctrine and God's will for you.
Yeah, and that's where I find verses 20 through 25 very challenging, because it's this whole idea of moving mountains is beautiful imagery, but Jesus doesn't put limits on it. Jesus says, if you have enough faith, this will happen. Doesn't say anything about God's plan and God's will. It just says, if you have the faith, this mountain will go into the sea. And to preach that, or to then have to nuance that into the world we live in, where there are plenty of people who have faith who want to be healed or want a miracle to happen, but it doesn't. They turn to this reading in hope, but then how do you nuance? It can be a difficult thing, because I do believe through faith, miraculous things can happen, but they don't always happen.
Absolutely, and you're absolutely right. I put my own twist on this story, that it has to be in God's will that it works, and I guess I've picked that up from other parts of the Bible.
Definitely.
That is, yeah. But you're right. It doesn't say that here. This is extreme faith. You ask for it, and it is going to happen. And as you said, so many times people ask for things, and it doesn't come the way that you want it to do.
Yeah, and I don't think we're never going to find a true answer to that conundrum. There's never going to be, I think, a stamp that says this is what was meant here, but it challenges us, I think. And I think it also in some ways challenges us to see where we are moving mountains without even realizing it. Things like, I look at the work Feast of Justice does. They move tons of food almost daily, and no one really thinks about how that is quite literally a moving a mountain. But we don't, we just see it as helping. So there are ways that the mountains move that we don't even notice it sometimes, or we walk right past it without realizing. So it can be a rather interesting thing to dive into. Do you think this story has anything to do with figs?
I don't think so. I think it's just the fruit or what can be produced by our, again, maybe the faith. If you have faith that.
I agree. I don't think that the figs, I think it could have been an orange tree. It could have been an apple tree. It didn't matter what fruit. I don't think this specifically had to be a fig tree. Although maybe that's why figs aren't more popular in the world, because they saw Jesus curse the fig tree and they just weren't marketable anymore. No. Yeah, no, I don't think the fig tree is terribly important because it's a fig tree. I think it's important because it's a fruiting tree that didn't fruit. So the last question I do have that's written here is, again, why do you think this story was included? Again, in such a concise book that is Mark, why keep this in? Because you could easily jump the Jesus cleansing the temple it's almost its own story. You could not bookend it with this fig tree and be just fine. So why do we think we kept it, or why do you think the author of Mark kept it?
And that is an excellent question. Number one, I didn't know that Mark was the oldest and the shortest, so that everything is in there would have meaning. Maybe just as the parallel, sometimes people can't see a story one way. Giving another example of it maybe for the farmers or the people that weren't able to go into the temple, they might be able to pick it up as a growth, agriculturally, and then someone else could see it as the temple. No, and not being productive, as you said.
And that's certainly a very valid point, because in all these Gospels, we always have to remember, were written to be read. They were written to inspire people in the faith and to connect with people. And so there's intentionality whenever Jesus talks about earlier in Mark, like the field and the sowing the seed. A lot of people would get that imagery in that time, and how to farm. A lot of people would get the imagery of the mustard seed. It was designed to connect with people. So the idea that you teach a lesson 2 or 3 different ways using different examples makes perfect sense. The other thing Mark likes to do, and a few of the Gospels, is they do like to do these bookends where they'll kind of have half of a story, they'll put another story in the middle of it, then another half. That's a literary trope you see throughout the Gospels. So Mark is just falling into kind of classical writing of the time, too, of the style that they would be functioning in. So I think it's included because it is, again, multiple examples, like you said. And sometimes the strange stories need to... There's a reason we're studying them now, and they're strange. they spark your interest. They cause you to ask what. So to keep something that seems a little odd is a good thing. Jade, it's just like in the what was it? Like there was a show Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and they did all kinds of normal episodes, and then one episode they did a whole musical episode where everyone was singing the whole time, and that was a strange way to shake up the genre and keep people interested and do something different with the same characters. So too we see that in the Gospels where they want to shake it up a little or change things around a bit. So they offer these stranger stories, I think, to make that connection. And again, not to say that none of this happened or anything, but to say that these stories were written intentionally, doing that they were trying to connect with people. So they're trying to find all the ways they can spread the gospel, and that spreading the gospel includes telling the story in an interesting way, and not just a way that's kind of monotone and boring.
Exactly, and they want to catch your attention and get you to come back for more.
Exactly, and just like what was it, the Nickelodeons? You go see the thing, it ends in a cliffhanger, and you have to come back next week and spend another 5 minutes. I mean, you want to keep seeing what's that's the goal. Well,
keep you hanging.
Yeah. I have no other questions. Do you feel comfortable that you've learned enough about the fig tree and the temple and everything?
I certainly do, and I had a whole different way to look at it now. I really did.
Well, fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining me tonight, and we will be back in a couple weeks. I don't know exactly when, but soon we'll be doing a Luther 101 class that's kind of like, I can kind of call it adult confirmation, but it's more just about doing these Lutheran central things and some Lutheran history, doing so that people can remember where we come from and what we're doing. And it's good to do it in October because we got Reformation Day at the end of October and all that good stuff. So stay safe, everyone. We'll see you in a couple weeks. Thank you for joining us. Have a good rest of your night.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.